Julia's Fairy Tales. The Warming Coal. There once lived 3 brothers in a cottage at the edge of a deep wood. The youngest, Klaus, was small for his age, but his hands had a steadiness the other 2 did not. Caspar stood tall and broad, and his voice carried clear to the tree line. Carol was broader still, and when he spoke in the house, the cups on the shelf shivered. They ploughed, they hauled, they split the wood, and the family lived on what their shoulders could bear. Klaus fetched the water and mended the smaller tools. He set the bean poles and pulled the weeds and rubbed the salt pork with ash to keep the flies away. Each morning he swept the ash from the hearth and laid the fire fresh. Each evening, when the logs had burned to their last coal, he knelt and blew it back to life. Caspar and Carol sat at the bench with their boots unlaced and watched him. The brothers worked the Lord's fields, and in the lean months the Lord's grain store opened. The grain came measured into sacks, and Klaus baked the bread, and no one in the holding went hungry. It had always been so. In their father's time, and his father's before him, and no one could say when it had begun. But in the last days before harvest, the elder 2 went to the Lord and said they would no longer honor their bond. They would keep the grain for themselves. No one in the village had ever done so. The steward asked them twice, and twice they said it, and it could not be taken back. They came home celebrating and drank the last of the ale and pounded the table until the cups jumped and asked Klaus to bake more bread from the flour he had saved against the winter. The harvest was thin that year. The bond was broken and the store stayed shut. By the deep of winter, their bin was empty. One morning, Caspar stood and told Klaus to leave. Carol did not speak at all. "A free man fends for himself," Caspar said, as plainly as he had said anything in his life. Klaus looked at the cold hearth, where the last ember had gone out in the night. He picked up his mending sack, and the door closed behind him. Klaus walked the winter road for a day and a night. The snow was deep, and no cart had passed in a long time. He had nothing to eat. His sack held a knife, an awl, a length of cord, and a piece of wax for thread. The cold came through his coat and made him shiver. After walking the whole night, he found a hut. It was small and low, its turf roof half fallen in, the door open on broken hinges. Inside there was a bench, a blackened pot, and a hearth built of river stones. The hearth was cold, but in its centre lay a single coal, no larger than a walnut, and it was glowing. It needed no wood, it gave no smoke, it did not burn out. He picked it up, and a warmth went through his skin and the bones of his fingers. He sat on the broken bench, grasping the coal. The wind pressed against the turf roof and came through the gaps, but the cold stopped at his skin and went no farther. He had not slept in 2 nights. He drew his knees to his chest and held the coal close and shut his eyes. The frost did not reach him as he fell asleep. In the morning, an old charcoal burner came down out of the deep wood. His hands were black with soot, ground so deep it would not come off, and his clothes carried the smell of cold pitch and wood smoke. He saw the faint glow at the boy's hands, and he stepped back, and he did not come in. He knelt in the snow and dug into the frozen earth with his black fingers, and turned up a pale root, and another, and laid them in a row. Then he stopped at the door. "It keeps out the frost," he said, "but it does not keep in the life." Before the tale turns colder, tell me, what is the warming coal in your own life? Leave your reading in the comments below. That night, Klaus set a root against the coal. He held it to the glow, but the root stayed frozen. The skin of it did not soften. He bit into it, and his teeth met the frozen flesh, and each bite made a single dry crunch. He swallowed what little he could break loose, and it sat in his stomach like gravel. He grew thinner, night by night. 3 days later, the old man came again. He put his palms together and rubbed them hard and fast until the soot-black skin hissed against itself. He worked his fingers and his toes inside their wrappings and breathed in slow and deep. Then he held his open palms out toward the boy. Klaus set the coal in his lap and tried, but his hands shook too badly to hold the motion, and his fingers would not close. The old man folded the thin fingers back around the coal and pressed the glow against the boy's wrists and went to tend his kiln. Klaus reached for the root the old man had left. He swept his hand across the earth, and it was not there. He found it at last against the far wall, far from where he had set it. How it had come there, he could not say. Something settled in the corner of the hut, a soft sound, no heavier than ash shifting, and it stopped the instant his lit face turned towards it. The coal's glow moved with him and showed him nothing. The corners held their dark. The old man came a third time. "Boy," he said, "leave it. Walk to the village. Beg." Klaus set the coal on the bench and pushed himself up. But the cold beyond the coal's small reach was savage. It took the air out of his mouth. His knees gave under him, and he sat back down and took the coal up again. He could not cross the threshold. The old man looked at him a long moment. Then he turned and walked into the snow and did not come again. Far off, Caspar and Carol's bin was empty too. Frost crept along the hearthstones where no fire had been laid. Caspar's belt hung 2 holes tighter than at harvest, and Carol's voice no longer moved the cups at all. Then a peddler came through the village and told of a hut at the edge of the deep wood, a boy sitting in it alone, a light at his hands that was not fire and not tallow, and not anything the peddler could name. Thin, he said, but the snow had not killed him. The brothers looked at each other and knew who sat in that hut. They set out at dusk, sure that he was hoarding what he ate. They crossed the broken hinged door, and the coal's small light showed the boy, thin as a twig, the coal cupped in his pale hands. Caspar's eyes went to the coal first. Carol's followed. Neither looked at the boy. "Give it here," Caspar said, and pried it from his fingers and drew it against his chest. The instant the coal left him, every week of borrowed warmth ran out of his body at once. The colour left his lips as the coal brightened in the brothers' grip, from a dull orange to the colour of a living ember. Klaus stood where they had pried his fingers open. His last breath left him, and he was still. The look on his face was one of mild surprise. The brothers set the coal in the cold hearth and crouched around it. The glow lit their faces and their hands, and stopped at their wrists. Behind them, Klaus stood frozen where they had left him, and they did not look at him. At dawn, Caspar crossed the threshold to search for food, but the cold came against him like a wall of black water, worse than any winter he had walked. 4 steps into the snow, and his legs would carry him no farther. The next morning, Carol tried, and got no farther than the door. The coal gave warmth without heat, and they could not leave it. and they could not live on it. Years passed, and the hut at the wood's edge became known as cursed. No one went near it. The path that had led past the bend filled with snow each winter and did not clear in the spring until it was not a path at all. At dusk, the mothers would point their children toward the trees and say, "A small light glows in there forever, but nobody ever comes out." And in winter, when the oaks stood bare, one might see a faint glow between the trunks. It keeps out the frost, but it does not keep in the life. If this tale stayed with you, like and subscribe. More fairy tales to come.